They expected death chambers. Instead, they found something that changed how they saw America forever. October 1944, Camp McCoy, Wisconsin. Sergeant Tanaka stood naked among 24 fellow prisoners, staring at rows of metal pipes protruding from concrete walls. Steam rose from nozzles he'd never seen before. The other men whispered nervously in Japanese, some convinced this was the end. Gas chambers, they murmured. American torture methods, just as their officers had warned. But when the valves turned, something impossible happened. Warm water, not gas, cascaded down. Real soap appeared in their hands. For the first time in months, some for the first time in years, these battle-hardened Japanese soldiers experienced something their own military had never provided: unlimited hot water. What happened in these showers would haunt Japanese prisoners, not with trauma, but with questions about everything they'd been told about their enemies. If Americans were the barbarians described in Japanese propaganda, why were they providing better hygiene facilities than most prisoners had ever experienced in their own country? This wasn't just about getting clean. These showers represented something far more profound, a glimpse into American abundance, organization, and values that shattered preconceptions and forced these men to reconsider everything they thought they knew about the war, their enemies, and themselves. Over 5,000 Japanese POWs passed through American camps during World War II. Their letters home, filtered through military censors, carried subtle messages of shock, not at cruelty, but at unexpected humanity. Post-war testimonies reveal a common thread: the memory of endless hot water, clean towels, and soap that actually worked. Today, we're diving into one of World War II's most unexpected culture shocks and what it revealed about two civilizations at war. We'll explore how something as simple as a daily shower became a weapon more powerful than any bomb. The power to change minds, challenge propaganda, and plant seeds of respect between enemies. What these prisoners discovered in American shower blocks would influence Japan's post-war relationship with America for decades to come. This is their story. To understand the shock these prisoners felt, we must first understand the world they came from. A Japan where tradition met desperation, where ancient rituals of cleanliness collided with the brutal realities of total war. Sergeant Tanaka, like most Japanese soldiers, had grown up understanding bathing as something sacred. In his village near Kumamoto, the local sento, the communal bathhouse, wasn't just about getting clean. It was ritual, community, a moment of peace in daily life. The Japanese had elevated bathing to an art form centuries before most Western nations understood basic sanitation. Hot springs, elaborate wooden tubs, the careful ceremony of washing before entering the bath. Cleanliness was woven into the fabric of Japanese culture. But the military had taught him different lessons about cleanliness and strength. From his first day of basic training in 1940, drill instructors screamed that comfort made men weak. Hot baths were for civilians, for women, for the soft. Real soldiers endured filth, cold, and hardship. The emperor's warriors needed only discipline, not soap. This wasn't entirely wrong, historically speaking. The samurai tradition emphasized endurance over comfort. But military propagandists had twisted this philosophy into something cruder, that Americans were soft because they valued cleanliness and comfort. Japanese soldiers were told their enemies were weak, pampered, unable to endure true hardship. American soldiers, they learned, collapsed without their luxuries: hot food, warm beds, and yes, regular baths. By 1943, when Tanaka shipped out to the Pacific, these ideas had calcified into absolute belief. Americans were technologically advanced, but spiritually weak. They had machines and factories, but lacked the spiritual strength that came from suffering. This made them dangerous but ultimately defeatable. Their own comfort would be their downfall. The reality of Pacific combat told a different story. Tanaka's first posting was Guadalcanal, where Japanese forces had been cut off from supply lines for months. What started as tactical deprivation became a descent into conditions that would have shocked their ancestors. Soldiers went weeks without changing clothes, months without proper washing facilities. Tropical diseases ran rampant through units where basic hygiene became impossible. Dysentery killed more men than American bullets in some sectors. Malaria turned strong soldiers into shivering invalids. Skin infections, left untreated, became gangrenous wounds. The jungle rotted everything: clothes, equipment, and eventually flesh itself. Lice infestations became so common that soldiers stopped trying to remove them. Open sores on legs and arms never healed in the constant dampness. Tanaka watched friends die from diseases that clean water and soap might have prevented. But questioning the conditions meant questioning the war effort itself, something unthinkable for a loyal soldier of the emperor. Instead, he internalized the suffering as proof of his spiritual superiority over the pampered Americans. By 1944, retreating across the Pacific, Japanese forces faced a new reality. Supply lines had collapsed entirely. The soap substitutes made from wood ash barely cleaned anything. Uniforms rotted off bodies. Water was for drinking, not washing, and often there wasn't enough of that. When American forces overran Saipan in June 1944, Tanaka had been wearing the same uniform for 3 months. His skin bore the permanent marks of tropical ulcers and fungal infections. Like thousands of other Japanese soldiers, he faced an impossible choice: death in a hopeless final charge, or the ultimate dishonor of surrender. The propaganda had prepared them for death, but not for capture. Japanese military doctrine stated clearly that prisoners were already dead to their families, their emperor, and their nation. To be captured was to cease to exist as a Japanese person. The Americans, they believed, would torture them, execute them, or worse, use them for medical experiments, just as Japanese forces had done to Allied prisoners. But surrender had become inevitable for many. Starvation, disease, and ammunition shortages made final stands more symbolic than strategic. When American forces offered surrender terms, thousands of Japanese soldiers made a choice their training said was impossible. They chose to live as prisoners rather than die as heroes. Tanaka's capture came during the final American assault on Saipan's northern cliffs. Wounded, starving, and separated from his unit, he stumbled into American lines at dawn. The expected execution never came. Instead, American medics treated his wounds and gave him water. His first meal as a prisoner contained more protein than he'd eaten in weeks. The psychological shock was immediate and profound. These weren't the barbaric torturers described in Japanese propaganda. They were organized, efficient, and surprisingly gentle with defeated enemies. But Tanaka and his fellow prisoners remained convinced this was temporary, a trick to extract intelligence before the real brutality began. During the transport to American prisoner of war camps, Japanese prisoners shared whispered theories about American intentions. Some believed they were being fattened for slave labor. Others thought they were medical test subjects. A few wondered if the Americans were simply too naive to understand proper treatment of enemies. None of them imagined what awaited them in Wisconsin. Facilities that would challenge everything they thought they knew about strength, civilization, and what it meant to be human in wartime. The showers were just the beginning of an education none of them had expected to survive to receive. The transport train wheezed to a stop at Camp McCoy, Wisconsin, on a crisp October morning in 1944. For Sergeant Tanaka and the 127 other Japanese prisoners aboard, this moment represented either salvation or the beginning of their final torment. None of them knew which. Through barred windows, they glimpsed their first view of America's heartland. Rolling farmland stretched to the horizon, unmarked by bomb craters or burned-out vehicles. Silos stood intact. Cattle grazed peacefully in pastures that showed no signs of rationing or wartime desperation. For men who had spent years watching their own country consume itself in total war, this abundance felt almost obscene. American guards, armed, but not hostile, began the process of unloading prisoners. Tanaka noticed something immediately. These soldiers looked healthy. Their uniforms were clean, properly fitted, recently laundered, their weapons were well maintained, their boots polished. These weren't the desperate, exhausted troops he'd expected from a nation supposedly bleeding itself dry in global warfare. The intake process began with medical screenings, and here the first real shocks occurred. American medics didn't simply catalogue prisoners for work assignments, they actually treated existing injuries and illnesses. Tanaka watched in confusion as a Navy corpsman carefully cleaned infected wounds on a fellow prisoner, applied fresh bandages, and administered what appeared to be genuine medicine, not wartime substitutes. Dr. James Morrison, the camp's chief medical officer, had seen hundreds of Japanese prisoners by this point, and their condition always told the same story. Malnutrition, untreated tropical diseases, dental problems that spoke of months without proper food. But what struck him most was their surprise at receiving medical care. Many initially refused treatment, convinced it was poison or some form of torture. The language barrier complicated everything. Camp McCoy was fortunate to have 3 Nisei interpreters, second-generation Japanese Americans, whose families had been interned earlier in the war, and who now served as cultural bridges in this most unlikely of circumstances. Staff Sergeant Robert Yamamoto found himself in the surreal position of explaining American military hygiene protocols to soldiers from his parents' homeland. "They don't understand why you care if they're healthy," Yamamoto explained to Dr. Morrison after the first week of medical screenings. "In their experience, prisoners are worked until they die. The idea that you would spend resources keeping enemy prisoners healthy doesn't make sense in their worldview." But the Geneva Convention wasn't just American idealism, it was practical policy. Healthy prisoners required less medical resources, long-term, were more productive if assigned work duties, and represented better intelligence sources. More importantly, word of proper prisoner treatment reached Japan through Red Cross inspections and prisoner mail, potentially encouraging more surrenders and saving American lives. The delousing procedures provided the first hint of America's obsession with hygiene. Prisoners were processed through stations where their clothes were confiscated for fumigation, their bodies inspected for parasites, and their hair checked for lice. For many, this was their first encounter with DDT powder, applied liberally and efficiently by medics who treated the procedure as routine maintenance rather than punishment. Tanaka submitted to the delousing with resignation, convinced this was preliminary preparation for harder labor or worse treatment to come. The efficiency impressed him despite himself, each prisoner processed in under 10 minutes, with medical records documenting existing health problems and treatment provided. This level of organization suggested resources and planning that contradicted everything he'd been told about American desperation and impending collapse. The temporary housing assignments revealed another unexpected aspect of American prisoner management, concern for prisoner hierarchy and social dynamics. Japanese military culture emphasized strict rank structure and unit cohesion, and American camp administrators had learned to maintain these structures rather than disrupting them. Tanaka found himself housed with other NCOs, allowed to maintain some measure of authority over lower-ranked prisoners. But the real shock came during the first meal service. The food wasn't luxurious standard military rations, canned vegetables, or processed meat, but it was abundant, nutritious, and served without ceremony or humiliation. Prisoners received the same basic rations as American troops, supplemented with rice when supplies permitted. For men who had subsisted on grass, soup, and bark during their final months in the Pacific, this represented luxury beyond imagination. More disturbing to Tanaka than the food itself was the casual waste he observed. American guards scraped uneaten portions into garbage bins without apparent concern. Bread was discarded if slightly stale. Coffee was poured out and replaced if it had grown cold. For a soldier from a nation where every grain of rice was precious, this careless abundance suggested resources so vast they defied comprehension. The camp's physical infrastructure told the same story. Buildings were solidly constructed, properly heated, and maintained with obvious care. Electric lights functioned reliably. Water flowed from taps on demand. Sewage systems worked efficiently and invisibly. These weren't temporary wartime expedients. They represented permanent investment in infrastructure that served no military purpose except maintaining prisoner welfare. During his first week, Tanaka began to understand that Camp McCoy wasn't an anomaly. Through conversations with guards and other prisoners, he learned of dozens of similar facilities across America. Hundreds of thousands of prisoners from multiple nations, all housed, fed, and cared for according to international standards. The scale suggested an administrative apparatus dedicated entirely to prisoner welfare, consuming resources that could have been devoted to weapons production or troop support. Staff Sergeant Yamamoto noticed the prisoners' growing confusion during daily roll calls and work assignments. "They keep asking when the real treatment begins," he reported to his commanding officer. "They can't believe this is permanent. Some think it's an elaborate psychological operation designed to extract intelligence." The gradual realization that American treatment of prisoners wasn't temporary or strategic, that it was simply policy, created profound cognitive dissonance among the Japanese POWs. If their enemies were capable of this level of organization and resource allocation for prisoners, what did that suggest about their capacity for actual warfare? If Americans could afford to waste food and maintain comfortable facilities for enemies, what did that say about their overall military-industrial capabilities? But the most challenging revelation was yet to come. As prisoners settled into camp routines, they began to hear rumors about the facilities that awaited them. Stories filtered through the camp about shower blocks with unlimited hot water, about daily bathing requirements, about American insistence on cleanliness that went far beyond anything they had experienced in their own military. For soldiers who had internalized dirt and discomfort as measures of spiritual strength, the prospect of mandatory cleanliness represented something more threatening than physical torture. It challenged their fundamental understanding of what made warriors strong and what separated the spiritually superior Japanese from their supposedly soft American enemies. The shower revelation was still to come, but already, after just 1 week in American custody, Tanaka and his fellow prisoners faced an uncomfortable truth. Everything they had been told about their enemies might be wrong. The rumor started on Tanaka's 8th day at Camp McCoy. Whispered conversations in the barracks spoke of a large concrete building where prisoners were taken in groups and never returned the same. Some claimed to have seen steam rising from its roof. Others reported the sound of rushing water and muffled voices echoing from within. Private Sato, a young soldier from Hokkaido, had been among the first group processed through what the Americans called hygiene orientation. When he returned to the barracks that evening, his fellow prisoners barely recognized him. His hair was damp, his skin looked different, cleaner somehow, but also strangely pale, as if layers of grime had been stripped away to reveal flesh that hadn't seen sunlight in months. "What did they do to you?" Tanaka asked, studying Sato's face for signs of torture or chemical burns. Sato struggled to find words. They made us remove our clothes. All of them. Then they gave us," he paused, searching for the right term, "water. Hot water, from pipes in the walls." The other prisoners exchanged glances. Hot water as torture made no sense, but Sato's obvious confusion suggested something more complex than simple physical abuse. His eyes held the distant look of someone whose fundamental assumptions had been shattered. "Were there chemicals in the water?" asked Corporal Hayashi, a veteran of China who had seen Japanese forces use gas against enemy positions. "Did it burn?" "No," Sato replied slowly. "It felt good." That's what I don't understand. It felt good. By the morning of Tanaka's scheduled hygiene processing, wild theories circulated through the Japanese prisoners. The most popular held that Americans used hot water mixed with mind-altering drugs to break down prisoner resistance. Others believed the showers were preliminary to medical experimentation, that prisoners were cleaned like laboratory animals before dissection. A few prisoners, influenced by horror stories from the European theatre, whispered about gas chambers disguised as shower facilities. The concrete building's industrial appearance, with its multiple chimney stacks and steam emissions, reinforced these fears. If the Nazis could construct elaborate deceptions to mask mass murder, why not the Americans? Staff Sergeant Yamamoto, the Nisei interpreter, found himself in the impossible position of trying to explain American hygiene culture to men who viewed cleanliness with deep suspicion. "They want you to wash," he told Tanaka's group as they lined up outside the shower building. "Every day. It's not punishment, it's their idea of normal care." "Why?" Tanaka asked. "What purpose does it serve?" Yamamoto struggled with the cultural translation. In Japanese military culture, suffering and deprivation were proof of spiritual strength. American culture viewed cleanliness as basic human dignity. How do you explain concepts of individual worth and health maintenance to men trained to see comfort as weakness? "They believe dirty soldiers get sick," Yamamoto finally said. "Sick soldiers can't work. They want you healthy." This explanation satisfied no one. If Americans wanted healthy workers, why not simply provide better food and medical care? Why insist on this elaborate ritual that served no obvious military or economic purpose? The shower building itself was unlike anything in Tanaka's experience. Constructed of reinforced concrete with industrial efficiency, it resembled a factory more than a bathhouse. No decorative elements, no traditional design cues, just functional space organized around a single purpose: washing large numbers of people quickly and thoroughly. Inside, the scale was overwhelming. Rows of shower heads lined the walls, each with individual temperature controls and soap dispensers. Drain systems channeled water efficiently away from washing areas. Ventilation systems managed steam and humidity. Everything was designed for maximum throughput while maintaining sanitary conditions. The American guards supervising the process showed no sadistic pleasure, no apparent interest in prisoner humiliation. They treated the entire procedure as routine maintenance, like servicing vehicles or cleaning equipment. This mundane professionalism was perhaps more unsettling than overt cruelty would have been. "Remove all clothing," announced Sergeant Martinez through Yamamoto's translation. "Place personal items in assigned baskets. Clothes will be returned after fumigation and cleaning." Tanaka and 23 other prisoners stood naked in the concrete chamber, surrounded by industrial plumbing and mechanical systems that suggested American engineering capabilities far beyond what their propaganda had claimed. The shower heads looked like weapon nozzles. The drainage systems could handle large volumes of liquid efficiently. If this was a gas chamber, it was expertly designed. But when the valves opened, hot water cascaded from every nozzle simultaneously. Not scalding, not freezing, perfectly regulated temperature that felt almost luxurious against skin that had endured months of tropical humidity, dirt, and neglect. The water pressure was strong enough to rinse away accumulated grime, but gentle enough to avoid discomfort. Then came the real soap, not the wood ash substitutes or harsh military detergents they had known. American manufactured soap that produced actual lather, that cleaned without stripping skin raw, that left a clean scent rather than chemical burns. Tanaka found himself standing under streams of hot water, holding soap that worked better than anything he had used in civilian life, trying to process why his enemies would provide this luxury to prisoners. The sensory experience was overwhelming. Hot water relaxed muscles that had been tense for months. Clean soap removed layers of grime that had become part of his identity as a combat soldier. Steam filled his lungs with moisture that soothed respiratory systems damaged by jungle dampness and poor nutrition. For the first time since his capture, perhaps for the first time since entering military service, Tanaka felt physically comfortable. But comfort was dangerous. Comfort was what made Americans weak, according to his training. If he enjoyed this experience, did that make him less Japanese? Less of a warrior? The pleasure he felt washing with hot water and real soap seemed like a betrayal of everything he had been taught about strength and endurance. Around him, other prisoners experienced similar confusion. Some scrubbed frantically, as if trying to remove not just dirt but the shame of enjoying enemy hospitality. Others stood motionless under the shower heads, overwhelmed by the cognitive dissonance between their expectations and reality. A few wept quietly, though whether from relief, confusion, or shame, Tanaka couldn't tell. The most unsettling aspect was the abundance. Water flowed continuously from multiple shower heads without any apparent rationing or time limits. Guards made no effort to hurry the process or limit consumption. This suggested resources so vast that waste was irrelevant, a level of abundance that contradicted everything Tanaka knew about wartime economics. When the shower period ended, prisoners were provided with clean towels, thick cotton towels, properly laundered and folded. Not rough military issue or improvised rags, but towels that absorbed water efficiently and felt soft against clean skin. Even these mundane items represented manufacturing capacity and resource allocation that spoke to American industrial capabilities. The final shock came with the provision of clean clothes, not the prisoners' own garments, fumigated and returned, but fresh uniforms in appropriate sizes. The clothes weren't luxurious standard military issue, but they were clean, properly fitted, and free of the stains, tears, and odors that had marked their previous existence. Walking back to the barracks in clean clothes, with clean skin and hair, Tanaka felt physically transformed. The accumulated grime that had become part of his identity was gone. He smelled different, felt different, looked different. Other prisoners stared at him with the same confusion he had shown Sato days earlier, but the psychological impact was more profound than the physical transformation. If Americans could afford to provide unlimited hot water, real soap, clean towels, and fresh clothes to enemy prisoners, what did that suggest about their overall military capacity? If they treated captured enemies better than Japanese forces treated their own troops, what did that say about American values and priorities? That night, lying in clean clothes on a properly maintained bunk, Tanaka confronted an uncomfortable possibility. Maybe the Americans weren't the barbarians described in Japanese propaganda. Maybe they were something more dangerous than cruel enemies. Maybe they were genuinely superior in ways that had nothing to do with weapons or tactics. The shower had lasted 15 minutes. Its implications would reshape his understanding of the war, his enemies, and himself for the rest of his life. What began as a shocking revelation quickly transformed into something more unsettling: routine. Within a week of his first shower, Tanaka found himself part of a daily hygiene schedule that operated with the mechanical precision of American military efficiency. Every morning at 0630 hours, following roll call and before breakfast, prisoners were marched to the shower building in groups of 25. The Americans had turned cleanliness into a science. Camp regulations, distributed in both English and carefully translated Japanese, specified exactly what was expected: daily showers of minimum 10 minutes duration, weekly delousing inspections, bi-weekly clothing exchanges, and monthly medical examinations focused specifically on hygiene-related health issues. Everything was documented, scheduled, and monitored with obsessive attention to detail. Captain William Henderson, Camp McCoy's hygiene officer, maintained detailed records of every aspect of prisoner cleanliness. Water temperature logs, soap consumption statistics, towel inventory reports, skin condition assessments, all filed in triplicate and forwarded to Washington as part of broader studies on prisoner health management. For Henderson, this wasn't humanitarian gesture, but military science. Healthy prisoners required fewer medical resources and posed reduced disease risks to American personnel. The historical context made American hygiene obsession comprehensible, even if prisoners couldn't fully grasp it. The US military had learned hard lessons about disease prevention during previous conflicts. More American soldiers had died from illness than combat wounds during the Spanish-American War. World War I had demonstrated that armies could be destroyed by typhus, influenza, and dysentery as effectively as by enemy artillery. By 1944, the American military treated hygiene as a weapons system, requiring the same systematic approach as logistics or communications. This scientific approach to cleanliness was incomprehensible to prisoners raised in a military culture that equated comfort with weakness. Japanese military doctrine emphasized spiritual strength through physical deprivation. Soldiers who required regular baths, clean clothes, or comfortable conditions were considered spiritually inferior, unsuited for the sacred duty of imperial service. The idea that cleanliness could enhance rather than diminish military effectiveness challenged fundamental assumptions about the nature of strength itself. Tanaka observed these cultural differences daily during shower periods. American guards, supervising the process, showed no embarrassment or discomfort with prisoner nudity. They treated human bodies as mechanical systems, requiring regular maintenance, checking for skin conditions, noting improvements in health status, and documenting any medical concerns with clinical detachment. This matter-of-fact approach to physical care suggested a worldview that prioritized practical results over spiritual symbolism. The soap itself became a source of daily wonder and confusion. Each prisoner received a standardized bar of military-issue soap manufactured specifically for government use, containing ingredients designed to clean effectively while minimizing skin irritation. The soap produced consistent lather, maintained its effectiveness in hard water, and left no harsh chemical residue. For prisoners accustomed to wood ash substitutes and harsh detergents, this represented manufacturing sophistication that spoke to American industrial capabilities. Staff Sergeant Yamamoto found himself explaining not just the mechanics of American hygiene requirements, but their underlying philosophy. They believe clean soldiers are better soldiers, he told confused prisoners who questioned the daily routine. Not weaker, stronger. They think dirt and disease make armies lose wars. This explanation satisfied some prisoners, but troubled others. If cleanliness truly enhanced military effectiveness, why had Japanese forces abandoned hygiene standards during combat operations? Had their own military leaders been wrong about the relationship between comfort and strength? These questions led to uncomfortable doubts about Japanese military doctrine and, by extension, the wisdom of their nation's war leadership. The weekly delousing inspections added another layer of systematic thoroughness to American hygiene management. Medical personnel examined each prisoner's hair, clothing, and bedding for signs of parasitic infestation. Lice, fleas, and other parasites were treated immediately with DDT powder and medicated shampoos. Infected clothing was fumigated or destroyed and replaced. Bedding was changed and washed in industrial washing machines that used water temperatures hot enough to kill parasites and their eggs. Corporal James Murphy, a medic from rural Tennessee, had processed hundreds of prisoners through delousing procedures. Most of them coming crawling with lice, he explained to new medical personnel. Tropical conditions, no proper washing facilities, same clothes for months. It's not their fault, but it's got to be dealt with immediately, or it spreads to everyone. The medical improvements were impossible to ignore. Within 2 weeks of regular showering, skin conditions that had plagued prisoners for months began healing. Tropical ulcers dried and closed. Fungal infections cleared up. Rashes faded. The constant itching from lice infestations stopped. Even minor cuts and scratches healed faster when kept clean and protected from infection. Dr. Morrison documented these improvements in weekly medical reports forwarded to Army Medical Command. Dysentery cases dropped by 70% within the first month of enhanced hygiene protocols. Skin infections decreased by 85%. Respiratory problems improved as prisoners inhaled fewer airborne bacteria and fungi. The correlation between cleanliness and health was scientifically demonstrable and strategically significant. But the psychological effects proved more complex than the physical improvements. Prisoners began to take pride in their appearance, a development that troubled some while relieving others. Tanaka found himself checking his reflection in polished metal surfaces, noticing how clean clothes fit better than dirty ones, appreciating the feeling of truly clean skin and hair. This attention to personal appearance felt simultaneously natural and forbidden. The camp's Japanese leadership struggled with these developments. Senior NCOs worried that their men were becoming soft, corrupted by American comfort. Some attempted to maintain traditional military austerity by discouraging prisoners from enjoying the hygiene facilities. Others recognized the practical benefits of improved health and grudgingly accepted the daily routine. Private Sato, who had been among the first to experience American showers, became an unofficial advocate for embracing the hygiene requirements. "Look at us," he argued during evening discussions in the barracks. "We're healthier now than we were as free soldiers. Our skin heals. We don't itch constantly. We sleep better. Maybe the Americans understand something we don't." This sentiment represented dangerous thinking according to traditional Japanese military values, but it was increasingly difficult to argue against empirical evidence. Clean prisoners were demonstrably healthier than dirty ones. Healthy prisoners felt better, worked more effectively, and maintained higher morale. If the goal was maintaining fighting capability, cleanliness appeared to be an advantage rather than a weakness. The Americans' systematic approach extended to every aspect of hygiene management. Laundry facilities operated on industrial scales, using mechanized washing machines and steam-heated drying systems that could process hundreds of uniforms daily. Soap was manufactured and distributed according to carefully calculated consumption rates. Fresh towels were provided on predetermined schedules. Even toilet paper was allocated based on scientific estimates of prisoner needs. This level of organization required substantial resources and personnel dedicated entirely to prisoner welfare resources that could have been devoted to weapons production or combat operations. The fact that Americans could afford such allocation suggested military-industrial capabilities that dwarfed anything prisoners had imagined about enemy capacity. By his fourth week at Camp McCoy, Tanaka had internalized the daily hygiene routine completely. He woke each morning, anticipating the shower period, looked forward to the feeling of hot water and effective soap, and took satisfaction in maintaining clean clothes and bedding. The routine had become not just acceptable, but desired a transformation that would have horrified his former self. The most unsettling realization was how much better he felt physically and mentally when clean. Energy levels improved, sleep quality increased, even his appetite returned to normal levels. The daily shower period became the highlight of each day, 15 minutes of warmth, comfort, and renewal that made everything else bearable. Standing under the shower heads each morning, surrounded by industrial plumbing that delivered unlimited hot water, Tanaka began to understand that American power wasn't just military or economic, it was systemic. A nation that could afford to keep enemy prisoners cleaner and healthier than those prisoners had ever been as free soldiers possessed resources and organizational capabilities that made Japanese victory impossible. The hygiene regiment had become more than routine maintenance, it was daily education in the reality of American strength. By his 6th week at Camp McCoy, Tanaka had begun to notice details that extended far beyond the shower building itself. The hot water that flowed endlessly from those industrial nozzles had to come from somewhere, be heated by something, and reach the building through systems that required planning, resources. and maintenance on a scale that defied his understanding of wartime economics. One morning, while waiting in line for his daily shower, Tanaka observed steam rising not just from the shower building, but from several other structures throughout the camp. A powerhouse near the camp's center emitted steady plumes of white vapor. Underground steam pipes, visible where they crossed between buildings, carried heated water to barracks, administrative offices, and medical facilities. The entire camp operated as an integrated system designed to maintain comfortable living conditions regardless of Wisconsin's harsh winter climate. Sergeant Martinez, supervising that morning's shower detail, noticed Tanaka's interest in the camp's infrastructure. Through Staff Sergeant Yamamoto's translation, Martinez explained the basics of the camp's utility systems. Steam plant burns coal to heat water and generate electricity, he said, pointing toward the powerhouse. Hot water goes to showers, kitchens, laundry, medical facilities. Everyone gets hot water guards, prisoners, administrative staff. Same system. This casual explanation contained information that staggered Tanaka. The Americans had constructed dedicated infrastructure to provide hot water to thousands of people simultaneously, including enemy prisoners who contributed nothing to the war effort. The coal required to fuel this system, the steel pipes to distribute heated water, the pumps and boilers and maintenance personnel all represented resource allocation that served no military purpose except prisoner welfare. During work details outside the immediate prisoner compound, Tanaka gained broader perspective on Camp McCoy's scope and complexity. The facility sprawled across thousands of acres, containing not just prisoner barracks and guard facilities, but complete municipal infrastructure. Water treatment plants processed thousands of gallons daily. Sewage systems handled waste from multiple populations. Electric generators powered lighting, communications, and industrial equipment. Road networks connected functional areas with the efficiency of city planning. The scale challenged everything Tanaka understood about American capacity and priorities. This was just one camp among dozens scattered across the continental United States. If Americans could afford to construct complete cities dedicated entirely to housing enemy prisoners, what did that suggest about their overall industrial and organizational capabilities? Corporal William Chen, a Chinese-American engineer responsible for maintaining camp utilities, provided technical details that deepened Tanaka's confusion. The hot water system alone required 3 industrial boilers operating continuously, consuming approximately 2 tons of coal daily just for heating water. The electrical system generated enough power to supply a town of 5,000 people. Water pumps moved over 50,000 gallons daily through distribution networks that included backup systems to ensure continuous service. It's not just about the prisoners, Chen explained during one maintenance inspection that included prisoner work details. Military efficiency requires reliable infrastructure. Sick guards can't maintain security. Cold administrative staff can't process paperwork. Equipment doesn't function properly without heated maintenance facilities. Everything connects to everything else. This systematic thinking impressed Tanaka despite his growing unease about its implications. American military organization treated infrastructure as the foundation of all other capabilities. Rather than viewing comfort and efficiency as incompatible with military strength, they saw them as mutually reinforcing elements of a comprehensive system designed to maximize operational effectiveness. The contrast with Japanese military infrastructure was stark and increasingly troubling. During his final months in the Pacific, Tanaka had watched Japanese supply systems collapse under American pressure. Airstrips became unusable due to poor drainage and inadequate maintenance. Communication systems failed because replacement parts were unavailable. Medical facilities lacked basic equipment and supplies. Troops lived in conditions that guaranteed disease and reduced combat effectiveness. At the time, Tanaka had attributed these failures to enemy interference and temporary logistical difficulties. But observing American infrastructure management at Camp McCoy suggested different explanations. Perhaps Japanese military leadership had never understood the relationship between systematic infrastructure investment and long-term military capability. Perhaps their emphasis on spiritual strength and willingness to endure hardship had blinded them to practical requirements for sustained military operations. The camp's waste management systems provided another lesson in American engineering capabilities. Sewage from thousands of people was processed through treatment facilities that produced water clean enough for industrial use. Solid waste was incinerated in furnaces that also generated steam for heating systems. Kitchen scraps were composted or fed to livestock. Nothing was wasted, but more importantly, nothing was allowed to create health hazards or operational inefficiencies. Private Sato, now assigned to waste management details, reported observations that disturbed traditional Japanese concepts of military propriety. They have machines that wash dishes automatically, he told fellow prisoners during evening discussions. Hot water, soap, and mechanical scrubbing, hundreds of plates cleaned in minutes. The Americans don't make anyone hand-wash dishes like servants. This mechanization of basic tasks suggested labor concepts fundamentally different from Japanese military tradition. Rather than viewing unpleasant duties as character-building exercises that strengthened spiritual discipline, Americans sought to eliminate unnecessary labor through technological solutions. Time and personnel not spent on manual dishwashing could be devoted to more productive activities. The medical facilities exemplified this systematic approach to infrastructure investment. Camp McCoy's hospital contained equipment that exceeded what many Japanese civilian hospitals possessed before the war. X-ray machines, surgical suites, pharmaceutical supplies, dental equipment, all maintained in perfect working condition and staffed by qualified personnel. The Americans had invested in prisoner healthcare not from humanitarian sentiment, but from practical recognition that healthy prisoners required fewer resources than sick ones. Dr. Morrison's medical reports, portions of which were shared with prisoner representatives as required by Geneva Convention protocols, documented infrastructure capabilities that revealed American industrial depth. Medical supplies were manufactured and distributed through systems that could respond rapidly to changing requirements. Equipment was standardized across multiple facilities, simplifying maintenance and replacement. Personnel were trained using educational programs that produced predictable competency levels. During the cold Wisconsin winter, heating systems maintained comfortable temperatures throughout prisoner barracks, while guards worked in similarly heated facilities. Coal consumption increased dramatically, but supply systems delivered fuel without interruption. The Americans had planned for seasonal variations and constructed infrastructure capable of handling peak demand periods without service degradation. Tanaka found himself calculating the resources required to maintain these systems. Hundreds of tons of coal monthly just for Camp McCoy, thousands of gallons of water daily. Electrical generation, sufficient for a small city. Transportation networks to deliver supplies from distant production facilities. Personnel to operate, maintain, and repair complex mechanical systems. The logistical requirements were staggering, yet everything functioned with routine reliability. The most unsettling realization was that Camp McCoy represented a minor allocation of American industrial capacity. While maintaining dozens of similar facilities, the United States simultaneously produced weapons, supplied allied nations, and supported military operations across multiple theaters. The resource abundance required for such comprehensive commitments suggested national wealth and organizational capability that made Japanese victory impossible. Intelligence reports from the Pacific had described American industrial production in abstract numerical terms: ships launched per month, aircraft manufactured annually, ammunition produced daily. But living within American infrastructure made those statistics tangible and personal. Every hot shower demonstrated manufacturing capability. Every warm barracks proved logistical efficiency. Every functioning electric light revealed systematic planning and resource allocation. By spring 1945, as news of American advances across the Pacific filtered into the camp, Tanaka understood that Japan's defeat was not the result of superior American courage or fighting skill. It was the inevitable outcome of systematic American advantages in infrastructure, organization, and resource management. Nations that could afford to keep enemy prisoners comfortable while simultaneously conducting global military operations possessed capabilities that traditional military thinking could not overcome. The daily shower routine continued, but its significance had evolved far beyond personal hygiene. Each morning, standing under streams of hot water generated by American industrial systems, Tanaka received education in the reality of modern warfare. Victory belonged not to the most spiritually dedicated warriors, but to the societies capable of building and maintaining the infrastructure that sustained long-term military operations. The transformation didn't happen overnight, but by March 1945, Tanaka could no longer deny what was occurring within himself and his fellow prisoners. The daily routine of hot showers, clean clothes, and systematic hygiene care had fundamentally altered not just their physical appearance, but their understanding of strength, dignity, and what it meant to be Japanese in a world that seemed increasingly incomprehensible. The crisis began with small observations that accumulated into larger questions. Tanaka noticed that he now felt uncomfortable when his clothes were dirty. He had begun to anticipate shower time with genuine pleasure rather than suspicious compliance. Most troubling of all, he had started to judge other prisoners by their cleanliness, unconsciously adopting American standards of proper appearance and personal maintenance. These changes violated everything he had been taught about military virtue and spiritual strength. Japanese military doctrine held that comfort weakened the soul, that soldiers who required cleanliness and convenience could not achieve the spiritual purity necessary for ultimate victory. If he was becoming dependent on American-provided comfort, what did that make him? Had he betrayed not just his emperor, but his essential identity as a Japanese warrior? The internal conflict was most acute during the evening hours, when prisoners gathered in small groups to discuss their situation and share news from home. Letters from Japan, heavily censored but still containing fragments of family information, painted pictures of a homeland suffering under total war conditions. Cities bombed, food rationed to starvation levels, civilians dying from diseases that proper sanitation might have prevented. "My wife writes that she hasn't had a hot bath in months," confided Corporal Hayashi, reading from a letter that had taken 3 months to reach Camp McCoy. The neighborhood Sento was destroyed in an air raid. She heats water in a pot when she can find fuel, but most days she just washes with cold water from a bucket. The contrast was impossible to ignore. While their families suffered deprivation that made survival itself uncertain, these prisoners enjoyed daily hot showers, regular meals, and living conditions that exceeded what many of them had experienced as civilians. The psychological burden of this contradiction was almost unbearable. Staff Sergeant Yamamoto, the Nisei interpreter, found himself counseling prisoners through identity crises that had no precedent in military psychology manuals. How do you help men maintain self-respect when they feel guilty for being treated better as prisoners than their families were as free citizens? How do you address shame that comes not from mistreatment, but from unexpected comfort? They ask me if accepting American care makes them traitors, Yamamoto reported to Captain Henderson during weekly prisoner welfare meetings. Some refuse to enjoy the showers, trying to make them feel like punishment instead of comfort. Others feel guilty for being healthy when their families are suffering. It's psychological territory none of us were trained to handle. The traditional concept of honor provided no guidance for this situation. Japanese military culture emphasized death before dishonor, but defined dishonor primarily in terms of cowardice, surrender, and collaboration with enemies. No one had considered the moral implications of enemies who treated prisoners better than prisoners' own government had treated them as soldiers. Tanaka struggled particularly with letters from his younger brother, still serving in the Pacific. "The Americans are devils, well," his brother wrote, describing combat conditions on islands where Japanese forces lacked basic supplies and medical care. "They bomb us daily, destroy our equipment, and leave us to starve. Only our spiritual strength keeps us fighting against their material advantages." Reading this while sitting in a heated barracks, wearing clean clothes provided by those same Americans, created cognitive dissonance that threatened Tanaka's sanity. His brother was suffering and dying while fighting enemies who simultaneously provided Tanaka with better living conditions than he had ever known as a free man. Which reality was true? Were Americans devils who bombed Japanese forces and angels who cared for Japanese prisoners? Could they be both simultaneously? The philosophical implications extended beyond personal comfort to fundamental questions about civilization and strength. If Americans were spiritually weak because they valued comfort and material well-being, why were they winning the war? If Japanese spiritual strength was superior, why had it resulted in defeat, capture, and dependence on enemy charity? Some prisoners attempted to resolve these contradictions by reframing American treatment as a form of subtle torture, psychological warfare, designed to undermine Japanese identity and fighting spirit. "They're trying to make us soft," argued Sergeant Nakamura, a veteran of the China campaigns who maintained rigid discipline despite camp conditions. "Once we become dependent on their comfort, we'll lose our essential Japanese character." This explanation satisfied some prisoners, but troubled others who had observed American behavior more carefully. The guards and medical personnel showed no signs of strategic manipulation or psychological warfare techniques. They treated prisoner hygiene as routine maintenance, approaching it with the same professional detachment they showed toward equipment care or administrative duties. Dr. Morrison's medical examinations provided objective evidence that complicated traditional notions of strength and weakness. Prisoners who embraced American hygiene standards showed measurable improvements in health, energy levels, and mental alertness. Those who resisted cleanliness in attempts to maintain spiritual purity suffered from preventable infections, skin conditions, and psychological depression. "Cleanliness isn't making them weak," Dr. Morrison observed in reports to Military Medical Command. "It's making them stronger physically and mentally. The ones who fight the hygiene requirements are the ones showing signs of breakdown, not the ones who adapt to our standards." The gradual recognition that cleanliness might enhance rather than diminish human capability forced prisoners to reconsider fundamental assumptions about the relationship between comfort and strength. Perhaps their military training had been wrong about this crucial point. Perhaps the Americans understood something about human nature that Japanese doctrine had missed. This realization was most painful for senior NCOs who had built their identities around traditional military values. Sergeant Yamada, a 20-year veteran who had served in China and the Philippines, experienced what amounted to an existential crisis. "If everything I believed about strength and weakness was wrong," he confided to Tanaka during one evening discussion, "what does that mean about the men I trained? The orders I gave? The soldiers who died following my example?" The crisis deepened as prisoners observed American guards and noticed that cleanliness and comfort seemed to enhance rather than diminish their military effectiveness. American soldiers were disciplined, alert, and professionally competent precisely because they were well-fed, clean, and comfortable. Their material advantages didn't make them soft, they made them more capable of sustained military performance. By the spring of 1945, many prisoners had begun to adopt American standards, not just for hygiene, but for personal appearance and behavior. They folded their clothes neatly, maintained organized personal spaces, and took pride in clean appearance. Some even began to criticize fellow prisoners who failed to meet these standards, unconsciously internalizing American values about proper self-care and personal responsibility. The most profound transformation involved concepts of dignity and self-respect. Traditional Japanese military culture located dignity in endurance of hardship and acceptance of deprivation. American culture seemed to locate dignity in personal cleanliness, health maintenance, and systematic self-care. Prisoners found themselves feeling more dignified when clean than when dirty, more self-respecting when well-groomed than when neglected. This shift had implications that extended far beyond personal preferences. If dignity came from self-care rather than self-denial, what did that mean about Japanese cultural values? If Americans could maintain military discipline while providing comfort and convenience, what did that suggest about the relationship between material conditions and spiritual strength? Letters home became exercises in careful editing as prisoners struggled to communicate their experiences without undermining morale or violating censorship guidelines. How do you tell your family that enemy prisoners receive better treatment than loyal citizens? How do you describe improvements in health and attitude without appearing to praise enemy policies? "I am well cared for," Tanaka wrote to his wife, in language that passed censorship but conveyed subtle messages about American prisoner treatment. "The medical care is excellent, and we have adequate facilities for personal maintenance. Please do not worry about my health or living conditions." These carefully coded messages, multiplied across thousands of prisoners and filtered back to Japan through family networks, carried information that contradicted official propaganda about American brutality and Japanese superiority. The cumulative effect was to undermine home front morale and raise questions about the wisdom of continuing a war against enemies who treated prisoners with unexpected humanity. By late spring 1945, as news of Germany's surrender reached the camp, many prisoners had quietly concluded that American victory was not only inevitable, but perhaps preferable to continued Japanese resistance. A nation capable of caring for enemy prisoners while conducting global warfare possessed capabilities that made continued fighting both futile and increasingly immoral. The daily shower routine continued, but its meaning had evolved completely. What began as feared torture had become welcomed comfort, then routine maintenance, and finally a daily reminder of American capabilities and values that challenged everything these men had believed about strength, civilization, and the nature of military power itself. August 1945 brought news that changed everything and nothing simultaneously. Emperor Hirohito's radio broadcast announcing Japan's surrender reached Camp McCoy through officially sanctioned channels, but for many prisoners, the emotional impact was surprisingly muted. After months of daily evidence that American victory was inevitable, the formal end of hostilities felt more like confirmation than revelation. Tanaka listened to the translated broadcast in the camp's main assembly hall, surrounded by men whose lives had been fundamentally altered not by combat or ideology, but by hot water and soap. The emperor's words about enduring the unendurable and accepting defeat with dignity seemed almost irrelevant to prisoners who had already undergone profound psychological transformation through the simple experience of being treated humanely by their enemies. The immediate practical question was repatriation, when and how Japanese prisoners would be returned to their homeland. But as the weeks passed and bureaucratic machinery slowly organized the complex logistics of returning thousands of prisoners across the Pacific, many began to contemplate what they would find in Japan and how their American experiences might fit into whatever society awaited them. Private Sato, who had evolved from fearful shower novice to informal advocate for American hygiene standards, expressed concerns shared by many. "How do I explain to my family that I was healthier as a prisoner than I had ever been as a free man? How do I describe shower facilities better than anything in our hometown without seeming to praise the enemy. The camp's administration, recognizing the unusual nature of prisoner experiences, began conducting informal interviews and surveys designed to gather intelligence about Japanese attitudes and potential post-war developments. Captain Henderson discovered that prisoner testimonies revealed more about American strengths than traditional intelligence gathering had provided about Japanese weaknesses. "They're not just impressed by our technology," Henderson reported to higher command. "They're impressed by our systematic approach to human welfare. They understand now that our industrial capacity isn't just about weapons production. It's about creating sustainable systems that support human capability. That's a more profound victory than defeating their military forces." Staff Sergeant Yamamoto found himself in the unique position of facilitating conversations between American officials and Japanese prisoners about post-war reconstruction possibilities. Many prisoners expressed interest in sharing their observations about American efficiency and organization with Japanese authorities, if given the opportunity. Some even suggested that Japan's recovery might benefit from adopting American approaches to infrastructure development and public health management. The medical documentation, compiled during prisoner internment, provided compelling evidence of American hygiene system effectiveness. Dr. Morrison's comprehensive health records showed dramatic improvements in prisoner physical condition that correlated directly with implementation of systematic cleanliness protocols. Skin conditions, respiratory problems, digestive issues, and parasitic infections had been virtually eliminated through simple application of regular bathing, clean clothes, and sanitary living conditions. "These results aren't just relevant to prisoner management," Dr. Morrison noted in his final medical report. "They demonstrate public health principles that could transform civilian populations anywhere they're properly applied." The prisoners experienced better health as captives than they had as free soldiers, not because of medical treatment, but because of systematic hygiene maintenance. As repatriation planning proceeded through the fall of 1945, prisoners began receiving limited information about conditions in occupied Japan. General MacArthur's administration was implementing comprehensive reforms that included public health initiatives, infrastructure reconstruction, and educational system modifications. Many of the systematic approaches to human welfare that prisoners had experienced at Camp McCoy were being introduced to Japanese civilian populations as part of democratization efforts. Tanaka realized with growing amazement that his shower experiences had been preparation for changes that would reshape Japanese society entirely. The daily hygiene routines that had challenged his understanding of strength and dignity were now being promoted throughout Japan as elements of modern civilization and democratic values. The irony was profound and troubling. Japanese prisoners had learned about American values through forced participation in systems designed to meet international legal requirements. Now, those same values were being voluntarily adopted by Japanese society as part of post-war reconstruction. Had the war been fought to prevent changes that Japan would eventually embrace anyway? Letters from home during this period described American occupation forces implementing public health programs that included shower facility construction, soap distribution, and hygiene education campaigns. Tanaka's wife wrote about neighborhood improvements that sounded remarkably similar to Camp McCoy's infrastructure. Reliable hot water, efficient sewage systems, and systematic waste management. "The Americans are teaching us new ways of staying clean and healthy," she reported in language that would have been unthinkable during wartime. "They say these methods will prevent disease and make us stronger. Some of the older people resist, but the children learn quickly and seem to enjoy the bathing facilities." These reports created complex emotions among prisoners preparing for repatriation. Their families were now learning voluntarily what they had learned through capture and imprisonment. The shame of defeat was complicated by recognition that defeat had led to beneficial changes that might not have occurred through victory. Sergeant Yamada, who had struggled most intensely with identity conflicts during imprisonment, found unexpected peace in these developments. Perhaps we were meant to learn these lessons, he suggested during one final group discussion before repatriation began. Perhaps our capture served a purpose beyond military intelligence. We can return home as teachers, rather than just as defeated soldiers. This reframing of prisoner experiences as education, rather than humiliation, provided psychological relief for many men who had struggled with shame and confusion about their American treatment. They had not simply been pampered by soft enemies, they had been inadvertently prepared to help Japan adapt to post-war realities that required new understandings of strength, efficiency, and human dignity. The repatriation process itself provided final lessons in American organizational capability. Transportation was arranged efficiently, medical clearances processed systematically, and personal possessions returned with careful documentation. Even the end of imprisonment was managed with the same attention to systematic procedure that had characterized daily shower routines. As Tanaka boarded the transport ship that would carry him back to Japan, he carried with him more than personal belongings and memories. He carried knowledge of American capabilities and values that would influence his understanding of civilization and progress for the rest of his life. The daily showers had been just the beginning of an education that would continue long after his return to freedom. The ship's facilities, operated by American personnel, included shower systems that reminded Tanaka of Camp McCoy. Hot water flowed reliably, soap was provided without rationing, and cleanliness was maintained as routine procedure rather than special privilege. Even during repatriation, American systematic approaches to human welfare continued to demonstrate values and capabilities that challenged traditional assumptions about strength and civilization. Decades later, when historians interviewed former prisoners about their wartime experiences, shower facilities at American camps featured prominently in their testimonies. Not as symbols of humiliation or enemy propaganda, but as examples of systematic thinking and resource allocation that had revealed fundamental differences between Japanese and American approaches to human welfare and military organization. Many former prisoners became advocates for modernization and systematic efficiency in post-war Japan. Some entered careers in public health, infrastructure development, or industrial management, applying lessons learned through involuntary exposure to American methods. Their influence on Japan's rapid post-war development was subtle but significant. Men who had learned about systematic approaches to human welfare through prisoner-of-war experiences became leaders in creating modern, Japanese society. The showers at Camp McCoy had lasted 15 minutes each morning. Their influence on individual lives and national development continued for generations. What began as feared torture had become education in the systematic values that would define the modern world. Standing under modern showerheads today, with hot water flowing at the turn of a handle, it's difficult to imagine the profound shock these simple facilities once delivered to men who had been taught that comfort was weakness. But for Japanese prisoners of war in American camps during World War II, those 15 minutes of hot water each morning revealed truths that would reshape not only individual lives, but the relationship between two nations. The deeper truth wasn't about hygiene at all. Those industrial shower blocks at Camp McCoy and dozens of similar facilities represented something far more significant. A systematic approach to human dignity that challenged fundamental assumptions about strength, civilization, and the nature of military power itself. While Japan allocated resources to weapons and territorial expansion, America invested in infrastructure that supported human capability and won the war not just through superior firepower, but through superior systems thinking. The contrast was stark and undeniable. Japanese military doctrine taught that suffering strengthened the soul, that warriors who required comfort were spiritually inferior. American military doctrine recognized that healthy, clean, well-cared-for soldiers were more effective soldiers. The outcome of the Pacific War validated American thinking in ways that transcended tactical victories or strategic advantages. For prisoners like Sergeant Tanaka, the daily shower routine became education in a different conception of civilization itself. Societies that could afford to provide unlimited hot water to enemy prisoners while simultaneously conducting global warfare possessed resources and organizational capabilities that made traditional military resistance futile. But more importantly, they possessed values that prioritized human welfare as a component of national strength rather than a contradiction to it. The psychological transformation was more profound than the physical cleansing. Men who had built their identities around endurance of hardship discovered that dignity could be found in self-care, that cleanliness enhanced rather than diminished military bearing, and that systematic attention to human needs was not weakness, but wisdom. These revelations challenged everything they had been taught about the relationship between comfort and strength. The historical irony is unmistakable. Japanese prisoners learned about American values through forced participation in systems designed to meet legal requirements for prisoner treatment. Those same values, systematic public health, infrastructure investment, and attention to human welfare, would become cornerstones of post-war Japanese society under American occupation. The men who returned from camps like McCoy became inadvertent teachers in the modernization that transformed Japan into America's closest Pacific ally. Modern Japanese bathroom culture, renowned worldwide for its sophistication and attention to hygiene, bears subtle traces of lessons learned in American prisoner of war camps. The systematic thinking, the emphasis on cleanliness as dignity, the integration of technology with human comfort, all reflect values that shocked Japanese prisoners in 1944 and became integral to Japanese society by 1960. The ultimate lesson transcends cultural differences and historical specifics. The treatment of prisoners, the most powerless people in any society, reveals fundamental values about human worth and civilizational priorities. Nations that maintain systematic care for enemies demonstrate capacity for systematic care for everyone. The shower blocks at Camp McCoy weren't just about keeping prisoners clean, they were daily demonstrations of American values in action. Today, as international conflicts continue and prisoner treatment remains a measure of civilizational progress, the story of Japanese POWs and American showers provides enduring guidance. True victory in warfare comes not from defeating enemies, but from demonstrating values worthy of emulation. The most powerful weapons are sometimes towels and soap, deployed systematically and without reservation. Those 15 minutes of hot water each morning lasted only briefly, but their influence echoes through decades of American-Japanese cooperation, mutual respect, and shared commitment to human dignity. What began as feared gas chambers became symbols of the systematic values that define modern civilization itself.